Coming to you direct from the nerve center of the galaxy's greatest comic. This is the 2000 AD Thrillcast.
Borag Thung Earthlets, and welcome to the latest episode of the 2000 AD Thrillcast Lockdown Tapes. I am your host, Malchar. I hope that you are all doing very well, because we've got another bumper episode for you this week. We talked to Ian Culbard, otherwise known as INJ Culbard, who's the artist on Brass Sun and Brink for 2000 AD. Now, he's somebody who's become a bit of a staple of 2000 AD over the last few years with a very distinctive style, and, Brink has become one of those series, we talked about it on the podcast a few weeks ago, that has really set itself apart. It's a slow burn, really atmospheric, great character work. I've talked to Dan previously about Brink, so it was great to be able to talk to Ian, not just about that strip, but also about his entire career, which is really interesting. How he came not necessarily from comic books, but having done animation, and that has led on to a fairly stable amount of work in comics with adaptations. Things like H.P. Lovecraft, but also, these long-form stories for 2000 AD. So it was an absolute pleasure. Thank you for everybody, as always, who's given feedback and suggestions for the Thrillcast. Trying to make these a reality. It's kind of fit those in around interviews that we've got lined up. Thank you so much for listening and for spreading the word. It's great to be able to see all the listens and downloads and everything tick up over the last few weeks. So it's been an absolute pleasure to be able to bring these interviews and deep dives to you. We're going to continue for as long as lockdown is going on. So let's start off with our interview with Ian Culbard about his work, not just for 2000 AD, but his whole career. So the most recent series of Brink wrapped up a little while ago, and I know there's more on the way in the future. Let's start off. Normally I go right back to the beginning and just kind of start there, but I want to talk about where you're at the moment in terms of your career, because it seems like just over the last few years you've developed quite a bit of a reputation. Like, your reputation is has kind of bloomed a little bit. So when I've seen people talking about the kind of artwork that 2000 features now, yours is a name that comes up quite regularly as something that's a little bit different. How do you feel about where you are now in terms of the work that you're producing?
There was such a thing with 2000 AD is right at the beginning. It was such a different bunch of artists. Anyway, if you contrast Bellardinelli against Kevin O'Neill, that is vastly different ends of the spectrum, isn't it? And because it's an anthology, it should always have a kind of place for that, I think. In terms of the work that I'm doing at the moment, where I am at now, I always feel like it's way better than it was. Like, you're always progressing as an artist, you're always learning. I don't think there's ever a point. Like, I'd hate to get stuck doing the same thing and not really progressing beyond, say, a style or something like that. I know that, like, the stuff I do is quite clean or, quite European looking or whatever, but I've always worked from the same roots that I've always had. So there's a huge amount of manga storytelling in the stuff that I do, probably people aren't as aware of, or there's a lot more adherence to things like, I follow a lot of film for influence, so it's more directors than comic book artists, really, and literature and stuff like that. So where it's at the moment is, I think, especially with something like Brink, is really pushing things like acting and stuff like that, bringing a lot more acting rather than action into the work that I do. And I think that I always started out doing that because the very first book I did was with Ian Edginton, and it was Picture of Dorian Gray, which is just a talk fest all the way through. And it's, you know, there's that, or is it 22 panels thing that goes around where you see that, like, of how to set up a composition for talking heads, and it says in it something like, because the writer's just basically just talking all the way through. And I'd done that and more than that, I think, when I'd finished Picture of Dorian Gray with Edginton, because I remember Disraeli actually showed me that afterwards. I said, yeah, I think I could add about another 42 to that. Different compositional shots for conversation. But I always like it when, like, the scripts that I get now are much more drama and emotion led sort of scripts. I think I'm more moving into that area of things, you know, playing out the drama rather than the fight sequence and things like that, which I'm quite interested in. And there's a lot more like TV, I think, as well, because of the way that you've got like a 10-hour movie TV shows now. There's a lot more drama writing going along, a lot more character development, a lot more subtle stuff happening, and that might be why I get that kind of work. But I don't know. I do ask editors why me when they ask me stuff, you know, ask for me to do things. But yeah, it's more like that's the place where I kind of feel really comfortable when I'm working, I guess.
Well,
and I also come from an animation background, so acting's a thing that was, you know, all action is, you know, you show a card trick, you don't show it like that, you show it like this. So it's that sort of. There's also like the way that emotion, you're used to observing emotion and the nuances of emotion as well, you know. So I think that's partly it.
Well, let's get sort of look back, and as a kid, were you a comics kid? Were you somebody who read a lot of comics?
Yeah, I was, because I'm not full English, as I like to say. I'm half English and half Polish, and my mother tongue is Polish, and it meant that English is a beautiful melodic language, but it's not easy learning it, right? So, whereas Polish is a phonetic, very much phonetic broke down language, very easy to read when you know how to read it, I guess. But I really struggled with English. So my mum, who worked for the NHS, like a lot of people that came here in the 50s and 60s, she used to get comics from doctors' waiting rooms. And so I had a lot of books that she'd bring back. She realized I was reading them because they had pictures in them. And all my essays at school were comics, like the Battle of Hastings comics type thing. You know, as a kid, I would just draw everything in response to stuff. And so my mother was really eager to get me reading stuff with words in it. And so it was comic books. So it's always been there. And I remember the first issue of 2000 AD. I specifically remember the second issue, but it's not until I saw the spinner from the first one that I go, oh yeah, I had that as well. Because I remember the second one, they had like these biotronic sticker type things, whatever it was. And that was covered in those on a bus in South London at one point. But yeah, I can remember 2000 AD from very early on, and it's stuck with me for years, you know. Yeah, it's something I grew up with. But there's a lot of other stuff as well because of traveling across Europe. So I was very familiar with things like Lucky Luke and Thorgal and stuff like that. So
we presume you were raised bilingual.
Yeah. So I was speaking two different languages, and recently I was talking to friends about. I was talking about this on the internet as well about the way we think in different languages as well. So if I say apple, I think of a green apple. But if I say jabłko, which is Polish for apple, it's red. So I know that we think differently depending on what language we've got in our heads. So I've always been quite interested in that as well. So yeah. And your outlook is very different. Like, I found that my outlook in Polish is quite different to English. It sounds bizarre, but it's just because of the framing reference for your reality is completely different in a different language. And culturally, it was quite different as well, specifically back then. 70s and 80s when it was still behind the wall. It was very culturally quite different to English, you know. So, you know, I can remember kids remarking on our house when we were growing up because it was all this wooden stuff in the house, and I never thought anything about it because I grew up in it. So but they all said how weird it was, but it's just foreign stuff to them, so they wouldn't know what it was. But it's culturally quite different, yeah. And yet, but once that wall came down, because I grew up on both sides of it, so because my mother's side of the family's from Warsaw, so I spent a lot of my like really overextended summer holidays over there as well. Like I was never at school in the first week of term, and I was never there at the end of school either. So I used to miss out on all these social groups as well. So that would form in the first few weeks, but I can remember that, like, yeah, it's quite a bit different. I can remember when McDonald's first arrived in Poland. Like that was so weird. There was just the West, which I was totally familiar with because I went to school in the West, creeping across as the wall came down and flooding it. You know, it's just so vastly different. Yeah, two different worlds.
Do you think in any way that the fact that you were brought up bilingual, that and this is complete conjecture on my part, just thinking about it, do you think that aided a certain amount of visual imagination? That, as you say, you know, you think about things in different terms depending on what language you're using. Is art images kind of the connecting thread, the kind of the universal language that works either way?
Yeah, because it's not it's a separate language entirely. I think it's really important when you've got a comic book and it's telling a story that you are actually actively telling a story at the same time as the writer writing the words. It isn't just simply that. It's, you know, it's a mixed medium, isn't it? So you are working together in tandem to kind of put across some sort of an idea and get an idea across. So I think those things are really, you know, that's quite important. Yeah, definitely. I mean, it was growing up as a kid. I've never felt English or Polish, and the only time I felt like I connected somewhere was when I was in France, because I was just foreign. I was like one thing. Because like in England, I'd be regarded as Polish, and in Poland, I was regarded as English. Even though I've got my mother's Warsaw accent, it'd be completely English, and like vice versa, it'd be the other way around. Whereas in France, I was completely separate. But I don't speak a word of French, and I was communicating while I was building a house as well with a whole bunch of French builders. And it was awesome. Just basically not being able to communicate, but actually finding other ways to do it. So yeah, I quite like those sort of like limitations that you can get from not understanding something and just finding a different way around that problem, which you do often, because I used to be a filmmaker. You do that often as a filmmaker anyway. So
you've got to tell us more about building a house in France.
Oh, it was amazing. Yeah, I was 19 and I was at art college, and I remember one of the art teachers there suggested to a friend of mine that we go out and just help them build this place, and it was just us carrying cement and mixing cement for the most part and putting together walls and stuff like that. But we were in the Ardèche, which is the Ardèche Valley. It was astonishing. It was the most beautiful place. We had a little river at the bottom of the hill where we were building this house. We'd go swimming after work, and it was amazing. And there was so much red wine. So it's like amazing place, loads of booze. Yeah, when you're 19, it's fantastic. It's the best thing I ever did.
So let's kind of draw like, so you're from London, but growing up you were back and forth between Poland and Britain. In terms of, and you've already mentioned this, but in terms of the comics you were reading, so the European tradition is not vastly different, but still very different to Britain. You mentioned Lucky Luke, and there are plenty of other those kind of iconic European characters. Were those kind of which comic book tradition was more formative for you? Do you think the European one or the British one?
I think a bit of both, because I used to read things like, I literally would read anything that came in, but there was a lot of things like that I'd get, like Tintin and stuff like that. But it was like Whizzer and Chips and all those things. I would read all of those. The thing about French comics, I think, just dissecting it later as an adult, they're tiered. So they're like 3-tiered strips, effectively. And so a lot of that you still get in stuff like Beano and Dandy, that sort of like mechanical construction of it on a page, like a whole page. You know, that then it's very similar in that regard. I think when I think of British comics, like to me, although 2000 AD is a British comic, it's very much like a European comic at the same time. I think it's not quite, when I think of British comics, I tend to think of the Beano and the Dandy, which is a very particular thing. And but that's just my perspective of it. I think 2000 AD is very much like a punk spirit type comic. It's outside of other stuff. It's not quite the same as it's anti-establishment. It's not establishment. Not to say that those things like being dandy are establishment, but they do form, like in my mind, culturally, a kind of very British thing. You know, that it's very sort of British looking. So I'll just put my phone on silent because that was nice and loud, isn't it? But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it's something I'm really interested in because I went to France on holiday when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Picked up French comics, even though I didn't speak or read a word of French. Still don't. But the thing I'm always fascinated about is any differences in kind of visual language, the way that comics are presented. Because I remember the supermarkets with shelves full of Bande Dessinée volumes, and I remember the Lucky Lukes and the Disney translations that always looked a little bit weird. And it's just I want to see how much of an influence that kind of awareness of something that was familiar but foreign had on you in terms of the way that you think about comics and any kind of deconstruction that you did.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, I kind of because I see it all as one type of, even manga. I see the whole gamut of everything from here to the other side of the world. You know, I just see it as being all essentially the same thing. I don't really see that there's sort of demarcation of there's this area and this area. Like I was saying with the Beano and the Dandy, the only reason I sort of think of that is because I think of the postcards. Like, you know, there's the self-end postcards type of the characterization of those figures. But then equally, you could look at something like that and you could say that's very similar to something Tezuka was doing, or, you know, in a way. So I do see it as there's no sort of like a borderline in that way. I kind of just feel like there's elements, and also people are really influenced by one another, you know, across different borders. So if a Mézières who did Valérian and Laureline, which I absolutely loved when I was growing up, it was that style. A lot of that stuff was looking at American stuff, you know. And also equally, there's a lot of Japanese stuff that's looking at American stuff, you know. So I think that a lot of that sort of seeps in, and I kind of don't quite see it that way. The only way I could define what's actually British in terms of comics is simply because I tend to think that Beano is or the Dandy, that sort of style of figure, is something akin to like the postcard humor, you know. It kind of that you would strongly identify with Britishness, I guess, or a British sort of aesthetic. But I kind of think they're too much of bits of stuff over here and there, really. Has that in any way answered your question? But it's also like the Japanese stuff, like I was saying, big influences. This really, Japanese is distinctive because it's pace. And that's quite a different thing. When you're looking at decompression and compression in a comic book, somebody comes into a room and pulls up a chair, whereas in a compressed comic, it would be just they're sitting in a chair. You know, so it's a difference of how you pace out time and you play with time. And those things are certainly there. But there's a lot of that in French comics as well, I guess. But also that might be taking some lead from Japanese comics itself. I think the waters are very mixed of all the kind of influences, I think.
When did you?
Either that, or I just don't look at things properly. I guess.
When did you begin to think about art? I mean, were you an artistic child? Were you always drawing?
Yeah, I was drawing pretty much straight away. Yeah. It was yeah. I just used to. I'm sure I think if I had had a PS4 when I was a kid, it'd be a very different stuff. I wouldn't be drawing. Why would I be doing that? I just to entertain myself, I think. And you know, when you get to that, a load of artists get that thing where they're in primary school and they're the drawer, and so that spurs you on. And then you get to secondary school and you're just another drawer. So it's like, damn, I've been demoted. So yeah, I think it's a little bit of that. I was definitely the kid who was the drawer in class, and I was doing biro tattoos on people and stuff. But yeah, you definitely, you know, I saved myself from getting bullied once because I drew a picture for somebody in return. But yeah, and it's also just definitely in terms of like a wordless communication and just exploring stuff. I remember getting really annoyed, like coloring stuff in, just getting really tired coloring stuff in. And then I also remember my sister used to draw a lot of stuff as well. I had an older sister who used to just draw. She'd draw Batman for me, and then just to annoy me, she'd fill in his eyes. So I had a lot of that torture to put up with.
What was your family's attitude towards art? Was it an artistic family? Were you known were they known for having an appreciation of art, or was this something?
Yeah, there was a bit of I think because it was a migrant household, so there's very much the attitude of you know, you arrive somewhere and you make something out of nothing. It's very much the attitude in our family, and you can make yourself something out of nothing. You know, it's also I grew up, you know, because my dad left when I was very young, so it's, I was living with my mum and my two sisters and my grandmother. I was the only male in the house, so yeah, it was very much seeing life from their perspective as well, in terms of, you know, the world at large, and also in contrast, what I was able as a boy to get away with. So I think the only time when my mum was reluctant was when I did life drawing classes, and she was utterly horrified. She said, full nude life drawing classes, and she said, I hope she wasn't sitting like that in front of you. She's a life model. For goodness sake. I started life models, you know, when I was about 11. I went to Camberwell Art College on a Saturday to start drawing life models, and stuff like that. So it was already ingrained by the time I got to foundation. I can remember the first time we did life models in foundation, and they said they had a lot of people that were just being real stupid about it. But you very quickly, you know, you change your mentality to, you know, in terms of subject and what you're drawing and stuff. And I'd already had that from years before, and, you know, it wasn't really such an issue. I think it's more of, you know, I think the other problem I encountered was that there were no comics courses. And I can remember just kind of coming up against things like, I really wanted to draw comics from very early on. I didn't understand why we didn't study them in art at all. Didn't make sense to me. The elitism within art became a real issue for me, because it is there. This concept that, you know, there's certain people that can draw and others can't, whereas I take the opinion that if you can sign your name, you can draw. Anybody should be enabled to be able to do that. You know, there's just not a privy thing, and there's certain levels of talent and stuff like that I think are just, you know, creates its own establishment problems, and people safeguarding what people can get in. When I know that an art career is essentially an enormous amount of luck and often very little to do with talent, and it can be, you know, you have to, certainly the biggest thing you have to do is create your own luck. But a lot of people, I see loads of people that just don't make it anywhere, but they're enormously talented. And so I kind of tend to think it's much more luck than anything else. And I think that it's also, I grew up in the Thatcher era of art school, lack of appreciation, like a conservative government that didn't really feel there was any value to art either, weirdly. And I can remember on careers day when, at school, and I don't know how we did ours. I think we were filling in a form, like a multiple choice thing. I don't even think we had a computer that said rudely to us, "You're going to be this." It was actually a person at a desk said, "You're going to be an accountant." I filled in all my interests and I just got accountant. And so I decided deliberately to fail maths and do everything I could to sabotage my own education in order to prove I could get a degree without one. And so, and I have now got a BA, so I managed to get through it eventually. But I hated the idea that there were these certain set standards and things like that. There was no kind of like, your interest, your individual, nothing was nurtured like that back then. I love the idea that we have comics courses now, but the very thought of them back then just it just never occurred to people that you could do something like that. And I think that's enormously lacking. And I think that's a real shame, because there's quite clearly, since the financial crisis, been a lot of accountants that should have been artists. So, frankly, the hell were they thinking? So, we're in a lot of trouble now because a lot of creative thinking went the wrong way. But I think it's a difficult. It was difficult coming up, through art college and doing all that sort of stuff. It's very, very hard, So art itself, yeah, and I studied lots of different types of art as well. So loads of different mediums, and painting, sculpting, loads of things, and one of my favorites was like just location drawing and all that sketch studies. So again, like the life classes, I was just really enormously lucky to have got onto those courses, when I did, and been able to do them. But I think, all those things are enormously valuable, because they do lead to other things. I mean, I think recently somebody was showing that graph where they showed that thing where it was like a least important jobs or whatever it is, and they're like number one was like an artist, but then somebody redesigned it without art to show you what that actually looks like. It's such a stupid thing. But there's a massive disregard for art, I think, generally.
It always strikes me, having talked to a lot of the older generations of comic book artists, people like Ron Smith. We had Mike Dory on the podcast a few weeks ago. How there is clearly a transition in the 50s and 60s with illustration going from being a trade, something that no different to any other apprenticeship or profession, and then in the 60s it begins to and this is probably class-based, this is probably to do with the changing economic situation in the UK. All of a sudden it becomes much more of a privilege. It becomes a vocation, so then when you get into the 80s, it's very easy to point it and go, this is worthless, this is pointless, this is just a people around. It's I guess you kind of got caught in that historical moment of this thing, finally, well, not finally, but people were literally coming out and saying this thing is not worth as much as other things.
Yeah, I think and then you're kind of finding your own feet with it as well, after that, because you don't have the guidance, and like you say, those trades would have been flipping useful. Little things like that would have been great. But I think it's just the lack of imagination there from people in terms of what you could do. I mean, I've basically, since I left college, I got a house, I've got 2 kids, we're married, most of the income, that's how we've survived, so it's an entirely doable thing. But like I say, it's also a hell of a lot of luck, At the same time, I've been very fortunate in a lot of ways, you know, in terms of falling on my feet with certain things and stuff coming in. I've been very blessed with working with some great people, you know, like Dan Abnett and Edginton and people like that. So it's you know, and those things, I think about the chain of events when those things come around. It's totally luck, but really good luck. You know, it's very fortunate.
I'm intrigued by the life drawing classes that you were going to at the age of 11. Now,
I don't know if they. Here's the thing: they were with a model, but I was 11. I can't remember if they were naked. It's okay. I'm not sure. I don't think they were, but they could have been. But I'm not sure. Part of my brain is going, they totally were, and the other part is, don't be silly.
I'm more intrigued about the age that you were, because when I was 11, I think the most proactive thing I ever did was join Greenpeace for 6 months. So
at 11?
At 11,
that's really good.
I was, yeah. Let's not get into that. But it's clearly you had enough of an interest and enough of a drive to go with that and to do it. You know, as you said, you know, if PS4s had been around, might have been a different story.
No, it's not. I wouldn't have been like that. My mum used to bring home like reams of paper, so I always drew on A4 sheets of photocopy paper. And so it wasn't like, you know, I would go through that within a month, no problem. Like several thousand sheets of paper. I was not a tree's friend when I was a kid, but I think it's not like. So I was kind of the opposite of you. You were doing things for Greenpeace, and I was actually probably responsible for a lot of deforestation. Yeah, it was, as a kid at that age, I mean, I'd been drawing from very early on, you know, because of language difficulties and things like that. So just being able to communicate in a way that was on my terms as well, you know, it's that sort of thing, I guess. Yeah, it was kind of tricky, because it's like, yeah, I still muddle my English, even though I'm barely fluent in anything now. But yeah.
And you know, you had this interest. You went to art college. Was it Camberwell that you went to?
No, I went to Camberwell when I was 11 on Saturdays. So they did extra live classes on Saturdays. Possibly nude, probably not. Then I went to then I went through the school system, and then I think around about just before I went off to France, and I was 19, I got on a foundation course eventually, because I went the long route around getting my BA, because like I said, I didn't have the qualifications. So I kind of went round it through. I did a foundation course, which I only just scraped. I shouldn't have got on, because I didn't actually have the qualifications to even get on that. So I got in on the strength of the portfolio. So, and because the woman that was interviewing me, she actually said, you shouldn't be on this, but however, your folio backs you up, so you're on. That was the only time I felt confident about my work as well. So that moment was like, oh, thank God. But like, then I did H&D, art and design, which I did in Middlesbrough. So it's my first experience of moving north to Yorkshire.
Wow.
Yeah, where I learned very quickly that they didn't like Southerners. So I had that going for me. And they didn't like students, and I was both. So that's good. So I thought I'd keep the Polish bit quiet as well. So we're really stacked up against me. But yeah, no, it was amazing, actually. It's the best place, as much as it sounds like, I know you're saying that, but I thought it was incredible, because it was everybody there, the attitude of everybody there was like, everybody's in the same boat and they all know it. And they're very much like a local, I felt at home there, weirdly, even though I was in a really rough end of town as well. But it was really, I actually really liked it. The friends that I've made there are friends that I've had for life, you know, because I think we were all in the same situation, and it wasn't that bad. But I quite liked it. And trips to Whitby and Yorkshire's amazing. Like as in one of the, you know, counties that I've ever lived in. It's been an incredible place to live. It's absolutely beautiful. And when I drive up to Thought Bubble, just the drive. I love the drive going up there and just looking around as I'm driving in the car, not paying attention to the road. No, I think it's an amazing place to visit. And Whitby's like the best place you could go when it's terrible weather. That's an amazing place to go, and especially when there's a storm in that harbour. You know, it's amazing. So yeah, absolutely loved it when I went up there. So I did about 2 years up there, and then I came back down. Somewhere in all of that, I had a gap, but not like a. I wouldn't say it was a gap year because that makes it sound like we had money. I think I became a security officer, so I wasn't at the Hayward Gallery. I was a security officer there, and then I did terrible jobs, and then I managed to finally get into uni at Kingston, and so I studied for 2 years there. But I studied at an animation course because again I couldn't do comics, so I did animation because you get to draw storyboards. That's the pure reason for it. And then I ended up homeless for a brief stint, and then out of being homeless I ended up an animation director within 2 years of that. So my outlook from that experience is like you can go from nothing to something within a hop, skip and a jump, I guess, if you're lucky. You can get out of that situation and manage to, well, in my case, because it's certainly not true for everybody, I think it's, you know, I managed to get myself out of that place and then on to doing film and TV, which was mad experience, but wasn't exactly what I wanted. And then in 2005, I did like a Judge Dredd fighting a man in a bunny suit attempt to get a job at 2000 AD. And my son was born. And on the day my son was born, I got a letter from Tharg saying thanks, but no thanks. I remember reading it and saying, oh, that's so lovely. He's just been so kind. You know, he's just been, oh, that's just the best rejection that I've ever had. Because to be frank, my son had just been born, so I didn't give a toss. I just had the best news ever. And then what would have been the worst news, but it came at exactly the right time. And it was funny to have read it that way. But then a couple of years after that, I ended up at Self-Made Hero through Edginton. But that's because I'd met Matt Brooker and or Disraeli. And just by I met up with him. I showed him some stuff that I pitched to Dark Horse. I got on the new recruits program at Dark Horse Comics. So I'd had a couple of stories printed, but I met with Matt and I said, this is how terrible my comics are. I can remember this conversation with him where he was just like listening to me berate my own work. Don't know why, but I thought it was awful. And he said, you'd be really good on this book. And because he turned down doing Picture of Dorian Gray because he was busy. And so that's how I got to work with Edginton. Not that that's the question you asked, but you can cross that one off.
Well, I want to focus just for a moment on this fact that you know, you studied animation, worked in animation, and you mentioned storyboards. Now, there's often a divide in opinion as regards what, because most of the people that I've interviewed who have worked in film and TV and have done storyboards, they are comic artists first.
Yeah.
But you're coming to it from a point of view where you are an animator first. So I wondered what your perspective, excuse me, sorry, very
but I was way more subtle about it.
Yeah. I wondered what your perspective was on what that taught you and whether that was useful in terms of becoming a comic book artist.
I actually came at doing storyboarding from the perspective of somebody who drew comics. Like, so in other words, my boards were very much like comic book boards. And because they're kind of very manga influenced, there's already that sort of like mix of languages anyway, visually. So I kind of ended up doing, you know, because when you look at stuff like Tezuka and from that era of manga, and they were taking a lot from film. And so I was already doing that within my own comics. So there was like a sort of diluted sort of mix between the two versions anyway when it came to doing film. So I never felt like the boards that I was doing, even though I did like, I mean, I did boards for Disney and people like that, but I felt like the boards that I was doing, there'd be less directional arrows and stuff. I wasn't cutting corners on certain visual aspects or using that sort of directional language within the comics, within the storyboards. They were much more comic book based. So getting away from film and coming back into comics, it just felt more like a sigh of relief in a way, because this extra stuff that you have to technically explain when you do a board compared to when you're doing a comic, because you're not relying on those additional bits to be able to tell your story, you know. So I think it's kind of the other way around, really. But again, it's also informed by film, because a lot of stuff that compositionally I look at is like things like Kurosawa films, and Kurosawa's got this great way of, as a comic book inspiration, because he frames within frames a lot. So you'll get a lot of sequences where it's just beautifully framed off, you know, like looking through a window and you'll get the frame of the window working to frame one character and then framing another, little things like that in terms of the language, in terms of film. So I do take a lot of those things still from film, but I used to always take those anyway from an early age, because I was film obsessed growing up. So yeah, I think it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, chicken and the egg, I guess.
In terms of visual language, you know, you're name checking lots of things like manga, like, you know, films. There's animation in there, and we've already kind of touched on storytelling to a certain extent, and it's been really interesting over the last few weeks of interviews, just how key storytelling actually is. Now, on a comic book podcast, to say something like that seems obvious. You know, of course, storytelling is really important in comics, but yet so many comics get it wrong. And I'm interested in what manga, film, animation have taught you about things like storytelling, pacing, as you say, framing, and how you feel that is that become an intuition now, or are you still trying to find better ways of framing and telling stories?
There's bits in composition that are really easy. I can remember we were talking on a podcast for an Australian one where I said, oh, your composition's really easy. You draw a box, draw a line in the middle, and then you place the person slightly to the side. That's composition. But there's more to it than that. It's like the Kurosawa, you know, Kurosawa's framing within frames and stuff like that. That comes across. I think it's the importance of it is a lot of that stuff kind of comes intuitively. You are responsible for telling certain parts of the story unsaid, you know, so there's a lot of unspoken stuff. I mean, when Dan and I work together, there's a lot of that happens anyway. But we discuss, when we're breaking down a story, it's very much something that comes from both of us. Because one of the things we do, we certainly with Brink, it's very much like, you know, the way that the Brink is written is Dan and I will figure out what the whole story is together, and then we'll break down parts of that, and then we'll come back and reform it and figure out ways of saying it or doing it, and whether they are through his dialogue or through something my character raises an eyebrows, for example, or something like that, then it's done that way. But there's very much, we take advantage of the fact we have a lot of communication between us when we're working on these things together to be able to put that across. And something like Brink is vast, it's huge. I mean, it's not like, I mean, readers, what they're reading is just one part of what the story actually is, you know. There's a way bigger picture to it that we're not even close to, we're just about scratching at the surface of in terms of Brink. But that's all possible from, I think if you get a writer who is able to I think it's the communication between you and the writer essentially is really essential in that way of working, because you have to make those two things fit together seamlessly, so that when somebody's reading something, you don't make things too busy when there's a lot of dialogue on a page, because you need to be reading a lot of dialogue, and so you don't want to be overburdening the visual thing with the dialogue. And then when there's no dialogue, you want to focus on performance, and there's a real exchange. But with Dan and I, that's very second nature, because we're so used to doing it now. But it's also something we did really early on. We picked up on that, what we call riffing, basically. It's just like one bouncing off the other, really. And we've done that from very early on. And that's part of the draw of working together. That and the world building is really just the biggest draw working with him. I think is just being able to do that. I mean, the way Dan put it, we were talking about, because we often assess what we're doing and how we're going about it. And when we were starting work on book 5 for Brink, he was saying, you're like basically doing the high concept and I do the low concept. So so if I've got, so the big weird idea, it will just be floating off, and he'll find a way to try and tether it down to make sense and stuff. And so we work in a very kind of free way when we're communicating ideas with each other, that kind of like just to get the best stuff out of each of us, you know, so that we can put that down. And yeah, and we've always said, like from the beginning, like there's the best. I have this thing called the rule of 3, which is basically, you know, if he has an idea and he's completely solid on it, and he's just, yeah, that's the best idea ever, and then I have an idea and I'm like, nah, that's the best idea ever, then we tend to think, well, we're both wrong. And there's a third idea neither of us have ever thought of, and that's 100% true every time. And it's always this like weird other thing that we never even considered, and we just go, oh my god, it was right there. We didn't even think of it, you know. So we work that way quite a bit, and he's great for that, because we have these huge conversations go on for like 3 or 4 hours on the phone and about the stuff that we're doing. It's very it's great. And that kind of dialogue between us that's very second nature now, you know.
One thing I'm really interested in is you've after that initial Dark Horse New Recruits thing that you did, you went on to Self-Made Hero, who, for those who are listening or watching and they don't know Self-Made Hero, they do fantastic original graphic novels, basically.
Yeah.
Many of them based on are either autobiographical comics or they're based on existing works of literature. And you did The Picture of Dorian Gray with Ian Edginton, and you've subsequently done At the Mountains of Madness, the adaptation of H.P. Lovecraft thing. Looking at those and looking at something like Brass Sun or even Brink, long form storytelling. Yeah. And not just the fact that, you know, these are long projects, but also you have to maintain a certain level of consistency with something like this. I'm interested in how you go about preparing for a long form project.
I go outside and I scream. I just well, one thing I did when I started, the very first thing I really, well, other than the Dark Horse thing, that was 44 pages out of the whole book, though. I got a huge chunk of the Dark Horse thing because I got 2 stories in there, both terrible. Anyway, but when I did when I was working on the stuff for Self-Made, I knew there were 120 pages of a book, and the number alone is scary. So straight away I said there's 60 double page spreads, right? So all the time when I'm looking at something, I look at a way of breaking it right down to a manageable, less stressful psychological impact, right? Because you don't want to think, oh my God, I got to do 120 pages. It's much more calming if you think I've just got 60, it's fine. And 60 is a huge amount. So then you break that down again. So, and what I tend to do is the way that I work is I draw one character at a time for a sequence. So, you know, and on a 5-page sequence, say for 2000 AD, I'll go in and I'll just draw Bridge, for the whole issue of Brink, but no other characters. And I've got it mapped out. I've got the roughs done, so I know where she's standing. I've just got to draw her performance, and that's when it's the acting. And so I just do that, and then I do another character, and likewise. And the benefit of that is that you end up kind of chipping away at the pages, so that when you come back to them next day, progressively bit more of it's done. So you don't look at a blank page and go, oh my God, I've got all this work to do. It's not like that. You just get through your roughs real quick. My roughs are pretty fast, very woolly. And when I come to actually doing the character stuff, I spend like the morning just being one character, and then I'd be the other character in the afternoon. And I just, then once I've done all the characters, I come back and I do the backgrounds, and then it becomes a color process as a separate thing. And then, but I'm breaking it down into one step at a time is much more productive, and you're able to kind of maintain it for much longer, because there's no, I couldn't do, I know there's a lot of artists that will draw one whole panel at a time, but you're breaking your train of thought 3-4 times when you do that, because you're switching hats, you know. But drawing backgrounds is not quite the same as drawing characters in my case. And so I have to kind of think differently when I do that, and breaking that up, you know, on a 5-10 panel page, it's a lot of times that you're breaking up how often you're having to change your train of thought, let alone, you know, what your actual subject you're dealing with. Because I took a lot of advice from a bomb disposal expert who talked about how you deal with stress, right? And one of those 3 steps to dealing with stress, and one of those happens to be that whole process of breaking things down to one at a time. So you deal with one thing at a time, and then you just consign it and move to the next thing. You don't try and consider all the things at the same time. That's all it is. And that keeps you nice and calm. And then, so that when you're dealing with something like 120 pages, it's a little bit less daunting and achievable then in like 6 months, say. And yeah, so my first break in was really to be doing all this big stuff, but learn how to deal with doing big stuff, you know, in terms of page count, you know. But so to do the long form with something like Brink, which is quite long for a 2000 AD strip, at last count, I think it was basically 20 parts, because one of them was in 2, but it was 19 episodes, but one of them was a 10-pager. But it was like, that's a lot of, I know that's like quite a chunk out of the year. And, but that discipline of just like approaching it bit by bit is much healthier than staring at that blank page and panicking and thinking, oh my God, I've got 120 of these things to fill in. That's very unhelpful. But it also allows you to kind of keep things on character, and it allows you to concentrate on not just the lines they're saying. You can think about what they're actually thinking about when they're saying those lines, because you stay in character, so to speak, from when you start the character in that section. So when it comes to acting and comics, it's really useful to do it that way. And you get through it a hell of a lot faster. And they're just concentrated bursts, really. But that answered the question, hopefully. I'm going to switch this email reminder off, because it's like, Jesus, sorry.
Fine. Doing something like the picture of Dorian Gray, where you worked in animation.
Yeah.
You'd wanted to work in comics. What did that process teach you? Were you a different artist coming out of it than you were going into it?
What do you mean? Right, coming out of
that project?
Yeah, by the time I come to the end of it, yeah, very much so. Like, because it was something I'd wanted to do from the very beginning, and actually doing it, I definitely feel like I had advanced more by the end of it than I had done, say, with like the Dark Horse stuff. Definitely, yeah. I felt like I could handle way more projects like that, because it was such a big sized project, you know. It was huge to be undertaking.
How long did it take you?
I think that was about 6 or 7 months. I think that was. They're normally about that. Yeah. The quickest I got through something but I'm very careful to say this because it's not certainly not a boast, but because I worked 20 hours a day. It was 20 hours a day, 4 hours sleep on a rota system it was very strict. So I had to do it and go in and do that and then come out, go to sleep, come back, 20 hours, go back, sleep. And that was on Mountains of Madness because I did that book in 3 months. So I wrote it in 2.5 weeks. I did 3 drafts in 2.5 weeks, which I can't even imagine doing now. And I drew it within 2.5 months, colored and lettered, 118 pages, I think. And that was stupidly huge, to the point where when I finished it, like my brain totally derailed. I could remember just like I did an interview on radio, was it 5 Live, and Matt Smith was on it, and Mark Miller, and all I remember was like I had the headphones on because we were talking about, for some reason we were talking about San Diego Comic-Con, and I'd been asked to join in. Didn't know why, but so I came along to join in. And all I remember was the countdown before you go on air. It's like 5, 4, 3, and then my brain just went 2, 1. Everything seemed really slow because my brain was still going like this. You know, after working for 3 months like that. So I've never done it again. And the next book I did took 9 months. So I was like, you just can't, you know, you can't work like that. It's very unhealthy. You know, it had very bad side effects after doing it like that. But I definitely was living it for 3 months solidly. And it's partly because, like, I can't remember why either. It was like I was trying to figure out if I was up against the deadline. I was really late. No, I wasn't really late. And then I realized it was because Lovecraft's such a nihilist that I just didn't really want him in my head for much longer. I was just plowing through it as quick as I could just to kind of get it done and out of the way. Or I don't know. Can't really say why I did it in that space of time. It was very, very invested, like way more than probably everything else, because I was trying to get my head around certain things like within that body of work. So yeah, I went totally nuts. I didn't eat properly that whole time or anything like that. So don't do it, kids. Don't draw comics. I think it's when you get people that, you know, work stupid hours and stuff like that, it's just not, it's not worth it to do it like that. It was the one big mistake, was actually doing it that way. And I'm kind of glad of having done it in a way, but having got it out of the way, because it wouldn't be the book it is without having done that. But I'd never do that again. You know, it doesn't matter. I learned to negotiate deadlines, I think, after that or something. I don't know. But it was a crazy quick time to do it. It could have been monetary, actually. Don't know.
But Celeste, which was the science fiction OGN that you did in 2014. I'm always interested with original graphic novels because, number one, it's such a bulk of time to do something up front.
Yeah,
you know, you're not serializing it, so
no.
There's a huge amount of self-discipline required in doing something like that. But also, what themes, what story you're trying to tell with something like Celeste? Was this your kind of, was it a sci-fi manifesto? Was it the kind of the sci-fi story you wanted to tell, or was it more the kind of, you know, these are just things I'm interested
in? I just done I can't think how many. I think I just done a bunch of Lovecraft books, and it kind of was like an anti-Lovecraft book in a way, because it was kind of like just the polar opposite of that, because that's the thing that's always interested me about him, is because he's such a, I always found there was things about him that were total opposites. Like he grew up in an area where he just didn't travel, for much of it shaping his worldview as a consequence, because he didn't get out. And whereas I was a travel baby very early on, traveling several different continents, speaking several languages, 2 different languages at least. And then he had little things like, and the way that I spell color and the way he spells color, where he spells it the English way, whereas mine is regarded as Americanized spelling, but it's because in my head, when I see the word color, it's got a K-O-L-O-R on it. So that's why I end up writing O-R. I just can't be bothered. And also my autocorrect can't keep up. So I type way too fast, but so it just goes, forget it. Yeah, all right, you spell it like that. But I think little things like that. So when I came to do Celeste, it was very much like there's certain things I'm really interested in, and kind of in a weird way, this is kind of like why Brink looks the way that it does, is because I quite like the concept of our perception of time, right? So I had an episode where when I was working in London as an animation director, I was on a tube train. It was really packed, and I collapsed on the train, and it was probably, I don't actually know why I collapsed. I never found out. And as I collapsed, the train became empty. Like nobody was on it, apart from what looked like a World War I soldier stood at the far end of the carriage. This is such a weird story. This is totally what I saw in like a hallucinatory moment. I just had this, I could hear like the echo of screeching wheels and stuff in the tube train. And I saw this figure of a guy stood there with a hat, and he had slicked hair, and then I collapsed, and that was it. And then I woke up, and it was cold sweat when I woke up, and I wasn't even on the train. I was on a platform, and there was a member of staff, and there was a person that had been on the train with me and stuff like that. And then that whole shock thing where you just get up and walk off. I did that. It's classic. I carried on going to work. And but that moment, like that instant where I was seeing this weird thing, I couldn't explain why I saw what I saw, because my brain just lack of oxygen or something, I don't know. And so that kind of inspired that, because I quite like the concept of what the present moment means. So there's like so when it came to like designing Brink, part of the reason why Brink looks the way that it does is because of that concept of the present moment, but also what that means in terms of sci-fi. I know you asked a question about Celeste, and this is bleeding off into this, but I'm just tangent in a minute. We can stick a pin in this. I'll come back to that. We're going back to Celeste. So, but the Celeste thing was, it was kind of looking at a life within a moment. And essentially it's a reflective moment in life, and all 3 of those stories are the mind and the body and the soul, and they were semi-autobiographical on top of that. So they had everything to do with why I was putting of myself into those things, because I was aware of, at the time when I was doing the Lovecraft adaptations, when you consider something like Edgar Allan Poe is translated into French by Baudelaire, how much of Baudelaire actually exists in Edgar Allan Poe, right? And so when I was doing the Lovecraft adaptations, I was considering how much of me was actually in those Lovecraft adaptations. Like, so when I was writing the Joseph Curwen, he's like possibly the most evil character in the world in Charles Dexter Ward, and I was adding to his dialogue. It was evil enough, but I was adding to his dialogue stuff that was pretty nasty, and that was coming from me. So, and I was like thinking about those sorts of things. So when I came to do Celeste, it was very much written from that point of view of like trying to explore those elements that come out of yourself as a writer into the work that you produce. So that's why when you look at it and I say it's autobiographical, you might go, what? But it kind of, in a weird way, it kind of is. It answers a lot of scenarios of stuff that played through my head at the time. Loads of things like dealing with issues of your self-image, body dysmorphia, all those sorts of elements of self-confidence, elements like that, and projecting them in some sort of a weird dreamlike momentary state. So that's where that came from.
So I
And
realized
how that links to Brink I'll shut up. No, but it's
No,
but
no,
it,
no, 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 no. On this podcast, never shut up.
well, on the brink point, the reason it looks the way it does is because something that Dan and I talked a lot about is the way that science fiction is imagined, right? And we talked about this before when we were saying like Outland and there's a period in science fiction from 2001 Space Odyssey to films like Silent Running, Outland's certainly one of them, Blade Runner, even Star Wars, a whole ton of films that off the back of the design of 2001 Space Odyssey essentially have a very specific look. And I bookcase that with Duncan Jones's Moon, because that's a kind of, it goes backwards Moon to that sort of look, right? And so that is what informs, so part of the reason why Brink looks the way that it does is because of that whole idea of, oh God, what was the, Jacques Derrida's hauntology and a bit of Carlos Ravel's concept of time. So the idea is that when you look at a piece of music, it's a singular note, but the note is informed by what came before it. So what you remember is what you expect of the future. So when you're listening to a piece of music and a singular sound on its own, then what you anticipate is informed by what you already know. And the Derrida one, which is the Jacques Derrida's hauntology, is how you have that the present is haunted by the past and the future at the same time. So that's what creates the present. And when we're looking at something like the design of Brink, that's very much informed by one of the themes being a fear of death and going beyond that, and how we hang on to things in the past, and how we are too afraid to imagine a future. So that's why it kind of looks that way, because I wanted to use it, but not use it. I wanted to have it echo those things, but not for no reason, you know. And Brink is all about being at that point before we go somewhere else, you know. So yeah,
one of the things I love about Brink, and we'll come to talk about Brink in more depth in a moment, is just that sense of an endpoint, of not just in terms of eschatology or apocalypticism, but as you say, just an inability to imagine past this point.
Yeah.
And for me, that makes it very much for our times, you know.
Yeah.
You're kind of looking at the future and you go, where is the future? It's wonderful that you and Dan have been able to tap into that. We'll come back to talking about Brink in a second, because I want to talk about Brass Sun.
Yep.
Is one of those times when 2000 AD has fully stepped into European comics. You know, it is one of those moments where in the constant tussle between within 2000 AD Saul, between American and European, it isn't gone completely one way. I'm interested in the genesis of the strip, how you came to be involved.
Well, Ian, he'll kill me. Ian had he had the concept for that, the orrery, and he had a very specific view on how that would look. And I think he wanted me to. There were a couple of projects that were kicking around. There were 3 or 4 of them that seemed like I might be a good fit for. That he had ideas for, these concepts that were there, and one of those was one of them was helium, actually, I think, at that point as well, which he then went on to do with Matt. But with this, it was originally intended that Matt and I both drew this, and he had the basic ideas of kind of what this would actually be like. And I think as I was drawing it, it kind of evolved from there, because I brought in like a Miyazaki kind of sensibility to some of the elements of it. And so he, I think then it became more Gorman Ghast-like, I think, as a result of that. I think there was always that in there, that kind of Gorman Ghast element. But that's very much, that was very much Ian, done it again. He did very much Ian pulling those things together at the start. Like he had very much the side. I can remember when he was telling me about it. He said that basically it's an orrery. What's an orrery? It's this. And then he said, and I went, oh, I know what an orrery is. And then he just went on with like, well, if you imagine the furthest part of it's like a frozen moon because the sun is dying. That's awesome. Count me in. And then we went from there. And it was originally intended that like Matt and I would do like one planet each. And so every episode would, like every story arc would take place on a different planet. So what we kind of intended to do right at the beginning just changed, because obviously the conflict and the scheduling conflict on that would have been enormous for Matt and I. It's just this silly, if you really think about it, it just was not, you could not actually do what we actually thought we could do. And so I ended up doing more of it than was intended, and at which point Matt resigned himself to, I think, just he was doing whatever he was doing, and that was fine. And then, so it ended up being very much me and Ian working together on just that. So Ian and I working together with that, because it's very much his, like his the way he writes. There's like, I remember there was one episode where he was talking about like, there was the house of like, where they had like an entire continent for cufflings. And there was a lot of Benelin involved in that because he was ill at the time. I was getting these scripts just going, that was bonkers. This is fantastic. And he goes, yeah, I've been very ill this week. Be ill more. This is great. It was really good. But he has a tendency to kind of write these like mad, like almost Monty Python-esque, like not Monty Python, Terry Gilliam, like kind of sprawling, huge fantasy type things. Really nice to work on. But yeah, and the design of it, I think it's just that, like I think it's like the junkyard in Labyrinth, you know, it's there's everything in it is like just stuff from somewhere else, you know, so it's a cobbled together kind of fantasy, more than science fiction, really. And we have everything having a functional purpose to it and stuff like that, you know.
In terms of your influences for the design, particularly of the different worlds, I was really struck when Brass Sun began of the scale of it, which I don't think is necessarily something we'd seen in your work in any major way before. Like huge vistas, structures,
Yeah,
real sense of scale. What were your influences in the design of those?
I really like, because I was mentioning earlier, I grew up on Valerian and Laureline Saint-Mézier's work, and a lot of that sort of, I'm going to blank on another name. I'll just call him Dan. Somebody, what's the name of the guy? I think it's, oh, wait a minute. No, it's going, I can't remember. Schutten and Peters, and they did this thing called The Tower, which was in Cheval Noir, which Dark Horse produced years ago, which are like black and white European collections, right? And they did the Babel's Tower story in there. That was very much like in the back of my mind as I was doing this thing of this person sort of climbing all over the environment to get to where they're going. And that was vast as well, because you're dealing with I'll totally spoil the story for you. The Tower of Babel, there you go, ruined it. And but it is really beautifully drawn, absolutely extraordinary. All this stuff is architecturally is incredible. And yeah, there was that kind of look, the Gustave Doré kind of stuff as well. And yeah, so enormous, but Gothic, and at the same time, I'm not that familiar with Titus Grown, but I think it's that whole, yeah, I've said the word, it's Gothic. It's just Gothic. It's enormous, like, and foreboding, and different kind of cultures come into fore, and like when they arrive on different planets and they've got the different customs, and just really nice to be able to do.
I mean, that's interesting for me in terms of something like Gothic. People get so hung up on the little finicky details of what is and what isn't Gothic and all that and the other. But
Yeah.
you're entirely right. It's a sense of scale. It's
Yeah.
it is being dominated by monolithic buildings, and it's,
Even a vast open heath is Gothic. So, yeah, absolutely.
As we've not seen an awful lot from Brass. Well, we've not seen Brass Sun for a while now.
Yeah.
If you were to go back to it now,
Yep.
would you be having to regress your style, or is
I just did it. I'd pick up where I'm at now with it. So I wouldn't. Everything grows and changes, and so as do the characters. So she's older now, and like he has this view to take that character, all the characters, into a sort of like stages. So you've had the stage where she was a young girl, and now we've got her as a woman, him as a man. So we've Sept, that character, and their lives at that point in their lives and stuff. And he wants to be able to see the full fruition of that. But I think it's I definitely would just pick up where I left off and just look at the stuff I did before and just say we can do that better now. And just do it like this now. I tend to move that up again. It changes as well when they go to a different place. The environment's entirely different. That's the other advantage of it. I mean, I had that when having to go back and do stuff from way back when we first drew her at the beginning, and I was looking at all these pictures of her when she was a kid. It was so weird. Like, it was like looking at pictures of your own kids when they're growing up, and you look at them when this 15 now, and you're looking at them when they were like 10. It's just really bizarre the difference with her. When I was doing a cover for something, and I was having to do one, and it was of her holding Yara in her hand, but it was her when she started her journey, and whereas the other one, which is on the cover of the collection, is later on. And I was looking at these two and just going, gosh, that's a hell of a journey for a character. And also all the things that she's been through when you're drawing her, and the fact that she's had this amazing adventure up to this point, and it's very hard not to put that back in those lines, when you put them down on the page, and just to age that character up and take out the lines under the eyes on them and stuff, because they've seen the world now, and it's quite something. It did, but I remember ringing him up afterwards and saying, it just makes me fully appreciate how much she's actually been through having drawn this, because it's just extraordinary. Just the stories having lives, I quite like that.
Time in comic books, having time and having a past in comic books is, and not to get too philosophical about it, is a political act.
Yeah.
Because you look at the stuff that the classic Umberto Eco essay about the myth of Superman, how time has no meaning in that universe, and that in itself is a political choice. When you're having a character who is aging, whether it's aging in real time like Dredd, or aging from story to story, that is creating a past that character cannot escape.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting you mentioned Derrida earlier and hauntology.
Yeah.
Idea that we are haunted by our own past and our own future. And you're entirely right. Ren in Brass Sun is one of those characters who is haunted by both of those things, because she knows what's coming and she knows what has been.
Yeah, exactly that. And it's that's one of the fascinating bits about being able to work with that, being able to put that into that, having been at that point, because I'd say that's a midpoint. The cover of the Brass Sun book, it's like the midpoint of where she's at for that particular chronicle in her life, and knowing where she ends up, I mean, I always thought that she kind of would, Edginton had like a really specific view of, like, he kind of casts his characters, and I've forgotten her name now. She was in, what was she in? Hannah. What's her name?
I know the actress. I can't remember what her name is.
Yeah, it's gone. I've just got the letter R, and that's it. So that's it. Anyway, that actor, he was thinking in terms of her, and whereas in my mind, she's kind of like Oh God, I've just Moomins. Oh, what's? Oh no! God, I grew up with this. What is with my brain? And yeah, oh no, it's really Tove Jansson. So I see her as kind of like Tove Jansson. So when you look at Tove Jansson, because there's lots of pictures of Tove Jansson, so you can see her as a little girl, you can see her as a woman, you can see her as an old woman, you know, and there's those stages. But the face and what remains in that face over all those years is quite interesting to me. So I tend to think if she reaches that age, if she reaches old age as a character, I already picture her as like an elderly Tove Jansson, you know, the characteristic of her nose and loads of those elements. She originally had a squint in one of her eyes because I thought, Edginton wanted me to get rid of it when it actually came to doing the strip. I had to redraw her for the very first strip because he didn't want the squint in her eyes. He wanted it kind of, and part of the reason for the squint was that if Matt was drawing her, everybody know who he's drawing, and vice versa, who I was drawing. So there was no so that he could do his take, because there's visually a very distinctive thing about the person's face that you go, oh yeah, that's that character. So that he could just do whatever. So he didn't feel like he had to draw in my style or I had to draw in his, you know, we could kind of do our own thing. But yeah, it's a very fond memories with that character. It's such a huge scope. And I remember when that collection came out, you could kill a postman with it. It was so large. It was, you know, it's a massive book, huge. So, and then to be able to hold a body of work like that is so bizarre as well, which you've drawn over a big period of time and you're looking through it, and it's weird. It's really weird.
Do you know if Ian's got plans to pick that thread up?
Yeah, he does. It's just part of the reason I did Brink was because because Scarlet Traces landed, so, and that left me without a project. So I contacted Dan, who I'd been working with, so that led off to that. But it's never got. I've done the last Brink I did at the same time. Not the last Brink, the last Brass Sun. They begin with B and R, so it's really difficult. But the last Brass Sun, I did at the same time as I did a Brink, so it's never not a problem for me to do both. I think it's fine. It's because we roll on with Brass Sun all the time because they're quite long, so we just go. The lead-in's quite big, so but we tend to, like, the day we finish, we start again, sort of thing. There's been a bit more of a gap this time, but that's picked up again. But with Brass Sun, hopefully, yeah, I'd like him to. I get asked that a lot, and I tell people, tell Edginton to write it. He does want to, though, so it's not like he doesn't want to. He's just been very busy. So, yeah.
Hey man, we're all busy.
Yeah, I know, but like he's like, yeah, we are all busy. So I still look at it. Get on with it.
So what I quite like there is we're coming back to the theme of kind of luck, of good timing.
Yeah, massively.
I love. I'm not a big believer. I don't believe in luck. It's not kind of what I go with. I go with serendipity. That kind of happy.
Oh, okay, I'll trade that up.
Yeah. With having a connection with two writers like Ian and Dan, who are so prolific in terms of their 2000 AD work, do you think that has helped you carve out a space somewhere like 2000 AD?
Yeah, enormously so. I mean, I was working with Edginton and I did the Holmes books together, and then we did, little known that we did this, we did Princess of Mars together. And we actually worked really closely on that one because I actually worked with him on the script on that one quite a bit in order to trim it down from the magnum opus that he'd written to this like slightly more conservative, like cutting scenes, and not cutting scenes, but overlaying a lot of the information and stuff. So we worked together on that quite a bit. And that, I think, led on to working on Brass Sun together. And I think I was just enormously fortunate. It was just, I'm here because Disraeli decided one day he didn't want to do Picture of Dorian Gray, and asked me if I would like to, just because I berated my own work. And then I'm here because of the fact that doing Brink, because I'd done Mountains of Madness and And so although I almost killed myself doing Mountains of Madness, or drove myself mad doing Mountains of Madness, I had really weird, when I did sleep, I had the weirdest dreams. But I'm walking at the bottom of the ocean, and every night, it was the same damn dream. And I would see these mountains upside down and then realize they were icebergs, and I was at the bottom of the sea. It was horrible every night. But that's how much it weighed on me, the whole thing of doing it. But he happened to read that, and he believed that I, N, and J were 3 different people. So he got in touch with, which is funny, coming from the guy who's regarded as the primary clone. Because a load of people think he's like loads of different people. So he got in touch with Edginton, and then to ask to get in touch with me, and then I ended up doing the Vertigo series with Dan. But that's all that fortune of enormous good fortune of just happened to be in the right place, and knowing the right person, and ending up with these careers with them, you know. So yeah, serendipity, or however you said it. Did I just mispronounce that? I'm going to go with that. That's fine. That's how it's said now, from now on.
And one thing that I'm very interested in is how your style, which on the face of it would fit so nicely, you know, naturalistic or contemporary stories, where or even fantastical ones. Sci-fi seems to be a real strength for you. You know, that world of metal, for want of a better phrase.
Yeah.
And I'm intrigued about your meshing of a loose and open, a very expressive style with a genre that quite often is about enclosure and dystopia and things like that. So, you know, you get something like Brink,
Yeah.
which is, when you drill down, as we said, when you drill down into it, it's a really chilling.
It's dark.
Theory.
Well, I'd started with, when I did Lovecraft, I mean, I deliberately went out of my way not to do it in, well, I just did it the way that I draw, but I deliberately stuck to not doing it like a death metal album cover was my objective. That was the post-it note on my desk. Don't make it look like a death metal album cover. And then, because a lot of like interpretations of that are quite bleak and quite dark, and there's a sinister tone. What's far more effective, I thought, is if I'm reading Tintin and we turn the page and we see a dissected human man dissected with a dog, you know, gelled together with a dog, and there's just blood everywhere in Tintin. You wouldn't expect to see that in Tintin, so it's far more horrific. And part of the reason that is because the Mountains of Madness, when you read it, it starts as a travelogue and it just goes bad. And so in one way I thought I'll use that and interpret it that way. And so not being the conventional type to the thing that I'm doing also means I'm out of my comfort zone. And that creatively, as David Bowie would put it, is a very good place to be, because it means you're exploring things that you would never normally explore and thinking of ways that you would never normally have thought, you know. Horror as a genre is not particularly comfortable for me. And it's consequently become like a scab that I keep picking. And likewise, there's a fair degree of that horror that's in Brink. And so it becomes something I can kind of come back to. Science fiction, the concept of doing like hard SF or something like that is never something I imagined I'd ever do. But I quite like the idea when we start these things of just starting a project and just going, I have no idea. I am totally out of my depth, and that's the best place to be. And there's another one was Wild's End. I can remember that actually came from a conversation Dan and I, he'd normally sometimes ask things like, you know, what do you want to draw next? And I said, War of the Worlds meets Wind in the Willows. So that's the high concept. And then Dan straight in with the low concept. This ties together like this, you know, it's brilliant, really, really quick. But then I remember sitting down when it came down to drawing it, and I just, oh shit, I've got to draw all these freaking animal-headed people. What the hell did I say yes to this? Oh God, it was my idea. You know, it's that the whole thing of like, you know, you just put yourself in this mess, now get yourself out. But it's good because it means there's a limitation almost straight away. And the best way of working is when you can create those limitations or those restrictions, you know, throw down the jumpers for goalposts, basically. You lay out your territory and you figure out what you can actually do within that framework. That's why when it comes to writing my own stuff, I'd rather set stories in places I've never been, because that's a great way to start. I have no idea where I'm going, so it's like, and let's see where we end up. So I think it's largely that, and also not ever feeling. I think growing up, I was English when I'm Polish when I'm English when I've never felt British, or I've never felt at home anywhere particularly. Other than France, loved it. Other than Yorkshire, fantastic. Because very much out of my element. I'm not really from that part, and I kind of like that, because it's a good place to work from. Not being the perfect fit for something and making your mark on something. We had really kind of rough training in that when we did Sherlock Holmes, because Sherlock Holmes has been done to death and his very iconic image and stuff. So the very first thing that I did when talking with Edginton on that, I said, we're going to drop every single one of the classic things about him and make him ours. Because what I learned was, like, the more of something you do, the more it kind of, you end up you self-references itself a lot. And I find that doing Brink as well, everything kind of self-references itself. And like within Sherlock Holmes, it was a case of get rid of the pipe, because he never really had a canonical pipe. He had a reed pipe, if anything, and he only ever smoked it in the drawing room when you read the books. Get rid of that element, get rid of the deerstalker, because he only wore it in Silver Blaze. And then start, and also the third design limit was, he's not a middle-aged actor. He's actually, late 20s, early 30s or whatever. So he's not actually a 60-year-old guy. He's a young man. So let's go back to those roots and then see what comes of that. And the only other principle was that, like, Holmes has he has a bridge. He's got a hook nose and and a furrowed, like a brow, and a pointed chin, and straight hair. And then Watson, as a complement to that, has got like a ski slope nose. He has a upturned brow, and he's got wavy hair and a sunken chin. So they fit together because they're complete opposites of each other visually. And so there's a lot of stuff like that I kind of learned from doing those books with Edginton in terms of design, philosophies, stuff that kind of span off into everything else that I've done, for sure. I have no idea what your question was.
I guess what I want to ask about is with your style.
Yeah.
When I've seen people go to it cold, so maybe they've seen a link on Facebook.
Yeah.
They've seen a panel that we've posted. Quite often there's like, oh, well, this isn't very 2000 AD. But
yeah.
Number one, that's plainly idiotic in the context of 43 years.
Idiots.
But, and you may quote me on that, sir. The thing that really strikes me, and it comes back to what you were talking about a moment ago, that sense of not belonging, that sense of if I borrow my Brecht for a moment, a sense of alien. And that for me is what, when people talk about 2000 AD's punk aesthetic, it's not spiky hair and
Oh no, that's not what punk means. Yeah. Yeah.
It's actually about a feeling. It's anti-authoritarian. It's irreverent, but it's also a sense of alienation of part of, and of seeing things anew from a different perspective. Yeah,
very much so. And even if those things are things you don't like I was saying, like the Lovecraft stuff, in horror as a genre, it's not, but I think that I think it's really important to also, the punk aesthetic is like just that alienation thing. I think everybody feels that, and that's why they form these groups, because they don't want to feel that. And so consequently you get people that end up in cliques or whatever, I think, or have a sense of, I don't know, you know, because as long as they're in those groups, then the things that bother the things, you know, the people that are cast outside of those groups don't have to bother them. I think there's a Murakami quote that does that in IQ84 where he talks about that, exactly that thing. But I think it's you know, because to me, good horror is noticing something, seeing something of yourself in what you're looking at. You know, that's perfect horror, because if you can feel like a monster looking at something, you know, or just feeling that sort of something in you goes, I recognize that. That's even more effective. And I think in terms of, you could apply that to lots of things, not lots of other genres as well.
Let's talk a little bit for a moment about the practicalities of your style, because you work digitally.
Yeah, I have done it from the beginning, which annoys a lot of people that collect art. I have nothing to sell. Sorry.
Is that a consequence of the animation side of things, or did you make a conscious choice to go in as a?
I just started. Is the practical beginning was the? I think it was the practicality of not having to scan stuff in, or there were programs set up at the. I've always used Manga Studio, and then that became Clip Studio from the very beginning when I started in comics. Prior to that, I think I did my 2000 AD Flash thing was done in Flash, I think, at the time. I used to work with just, you know, and tablet was something, yeah, totally, that we used in animation all the time. And so transferring across to that, it just seemed like it just made the most sense. So it was never really, I mean, the way I use digital tools is very basic. You know, I still don't know about 90% of what's on Photoshop. I just basically press, as long as I can make a mark with it, then I'm fine. And, you know, and I'm very much the same in Clip Studio. It's so silly. There's tons of stuff Clip Studio can do that I'm just not familiar with at all. And, you know, so but the brilliant thing with Clip Studio is because I always hated drawing the grids. That was it. It was just measuring stuff because it's numbers. I'm rubbish. So I would just, and the very fact that it just does it for you, you can just split, you can carve it up in whatever way you want, the page grid and reuse grids and stuff like that for the page panel layout and stuff. It's just a huge time saver. And so I love using the Clip Studio. It's fantastic. But, it's very much from that background of working with a Wacom tablet back then. I've got a Cintiq now, but I mostly draw on the Apple iPad. He says, in the hope of getting a freebie. Can I have the new one, please? No,
I don't know how many executives from Apple actually listen to this.
Loads, because they all read 2000 AD. It's very obvious. I think it's I use the iPad more than anything because I find it difficult drawing with the. I'm not going to get a Wacom tablet if I say that. I find it difficult working with the Wacom tablet because it kind of, you have to grip it like in a really weird way. I can't show you right now, but the Apple Pencils. Oh my God, product placement. The Apple Pencil sits so much better in your hand. It's true, it does. And so I find it easier because I can draw for way longer then. Whereas with the other one, I find it quite hard. But I do. They need to bring out a different pen, but I think it's but they're both fantastic, you know. And the fact that you can just cross-platform, you can go from the tablet to the desktop really easily, and you know, so it's just very economically in terms of time. It's just a huge saver, and because of that thing where I was talking about flow, it doesn't interrupt it at all. You can just jump from one thing to the other, and the other one creatively is like, especially with a tablet, you can just get up and go somewhere else and draw. You're not chained to a desk, and it's just so much easier, you know. So no, I really like doing it that way. Digital's fantastic.
And thinking about the way that your style has evolved, do you have a different start point than you used to? I'm thinking in terms of thumbnails, the actual physical process of creating a page, not just physically, but in your mind. Have you streamlined that so it's much more? I know exactly how I'm going to tackle this. I can cut out certain elements that I used to.
I still do, like, I draw all over the script, so I still do that. When you do the first read, you I thumbnail really quickly, and then often I very seldom change from what I thumbnailed of what I saw in my head. Because when I used to do, for example, when dealing with students with storyboarding, and I'd go and see students and they'd do these amazingly finished storyboards, and I'd always say that storyboarding is essentially reportage from the front line in your head. You've got to get it down as fast as you can. And I don't care if your teacher doesn't understand what you're drawing. As long as you do, it doesn't matter. Do the cleanup later. Just get the idea out of your head, because it's as flowing as you can possibly get it. So that those interruptions that you put in the way of all of that is what hampers stuff much of the time. You've got to get it from in here, where you've just seen it, onto there, so that people can understand it. And a lot of people get caught up on things like, oh, it's never as good as I imagined it. It won't be, because you're probably imagining something flipping amazing and looking really real, and you can't do that. You've got to convey it in a much simpler way than what you're actually seeing in your head, maybe. But you get to a stage with all of that where you consistently do that, and it does end up being how you kind of see it in your head, because you kind of design, almost ontological design, back on yourself. You kind of end up doing it in a way that you're informed by much of the stuff you already see. So when I'm thinking of corridors, for example, in Brink, I know exactly what they look like because I've drawn them. How they originally looked in my head, I couldn't tell you, but I now know what they look like, because they look like the corridors in Brink. If I'm thinking of a bridge, there's a very specific graphic in my head. And whereas when I originally envisioned her, she probably was she was a bit of Frida Kahlo, played by oh God, just had the name a second ago, Salma Hayek. So there was an element of definitely like Frida Kahlo in there with the original look of her, but now she's become this distinctive other entity. So when I imagine her, I just see the drawing straight away, and it's that sort of thing. Yeah. And now, and again, I can't remember what you asked. Vaguely the right answer again.
No, it was absolutely on point. I guess I'm interested in where Brink is going in terms of the collaboration between you and Dan.
Yeah,
because it has been fantastically popular with the readers.
yeah,
it is one of those slow burns. It is so slow.
yeah.
Great. And that in itself is a challenge to perceived notions of what 2000 AD is all about. You can have a Talking Heads episode. I think, if anything, Dan has taught us over the last sort of 10 years, it's that you can have episodes of
totally
Talking Heads. Is there ever a point where you you think, come on, Dan, just pick up the pace?
No. Last series we had a gunfight, and he told me, I mean, the thing is, we worked this whole thing out before anyway, so I knew it was coming. But I remember when he told me certain details of the gunfight as we got closer to it. Like it was to do with jackets and stuff, like vests, like body armor and stuff. And I just thought, that's going to be awesome, because it's going to be like waiting for a storm sort of feeling to it. But it has to, I'm never sitting there thinking, can we have that like in page one and stuff like that? Because I just think those things, you have to earn them. They're like, the gunfight is there. Like, I always think of, do you remember Deadwood when that was on TV? And the level of swearing in that. And the brilliant use of the swearing in that was, it made you feel like someone was going to get shot at any second. And it should do, because that's the environment the world was in, So when we have stuff like that, there's a tempo to it as it builds up and we get to it, and then it kicks off, because violence is momentary and it can be very sudden, and over in seconds as well. That's the other thing. So I never really thrive those bits where it's like, I don't really look forward to the, I'm not calm. I never kind of think, come on, Dan, stop talking. I like the scenes where they're talking, because I like stuff like, I like the nuances in the way that people perform, or actors that, method actors, with the way they chew up scenery by barely doing anything, but they put across some sort of conveying some sort of mood or menace. It's perfect for actually method acting. Is really good. The Kuleshov effect, you've heard of that, right? We have the picture of a person looking really still, and then cut to a picture of a bowl of soup, and then you cut person really still, cut to a picture of a crying baby or whatever. But the emotion that you read is whatever you're reading as the reader into it, rather than the actual performance, because that's again that whole thing of like what's inside you as a reader come into the book. That comes to that whole death of the author type thing, doesn't it? Because at some point the reader's going to read what they're going to read into it, into what you're conveying. And in some ways you want to leave that, you want to tap into a certain primal element of that, like fear, for example, or deep emotion, and let the reader run with that when they apply it to the character, because they'll put more into that performance than you actually probably put in, you know, so they'll read way more into it than you put in. So, but finding the right level of how much you allow to do, that's, I think, the trick, you know, of how much the reader can read into something. So I think, I don't even know if I've answered your question. We're going to do this a lot. Jesus.
I'm just enjoying how quickly this conversation turned to the metaphysical. It's wonderful.
Yeah, sorry. I don't do anything in straight lines, but I think it's, yeah. Like I said, when Dan and I work together on an idea, I'm usually the high concept one, he's the low concept one. I tend to thinking way outside the box over there, and he'll just go and tether that up. But it's all the stuff that we do in Brink is, I nearly said Brass Sun. All the stuff we do in Brink is right from day one. I can remember the original concept was quite large, like was really large. And then I remember Dan going, yeah, that's great, but what if we then go all the way over here and we tell the story from this little tiny closet over here, sort of thing, and you know, and we'll just look at this person over here and what their reaction would be to this thing over there. And that's really where it kind of came from. And then every time we break the story, we sort of sit down, like every time there's like at the start of each of the books that we've done so far, we'll have a sit down about where we want to take the characters, what we want to do with them, what would be a really good scene to include, what would be a great way to explore this personality, or all those sorts of things. And we sit and break all of those things down until it's broken down into a point by point, an episode by episode breakdown of the whole series for that particular book. And then that gets broken down into scripts, and it's really at the point where Dan goes away and just puts down the words, and then I go away and then put down the pictures, that we kind of go our separate ways and then come back and we kind of look at what we've done, you know, and how that works. And there's occasional times where he'll change bits of dialogue, or there's often a case of me adding more panels, or, you know, it tends to be me putting panels in rather than taking them out because of the whole decompression side of things a little bit, to give more weight to certain lines. So I'll move certain lines around, and that brings me to Simon Boland, because like he's an amazingly talented and phenomenally patient, I think, letterer, because of the fact that the amount of work he does on this series is astonishing, because he has to deal with, not only does he have to deal with the regular balloons that we're putting in, and often, you know, sometimes even me breaking, not often, but sometimes me breaking the first speaker on the left rule for a reason. So, and then, but he also has to deal with the fact that he's got all these tags for everything. And then on top of that, we made his job even harder when it came to Hatebox, because we decided to put in redacted speech, which is when Dan writes the script, that swearing's in there. And quite a few times it's a case of going through it, making sure that he's actually redacted the swearing. It's in bold so that he can spot it, but it's quite a lot. But it's a huge amount of work on Simon's part, and it's like he's just fantastic at his job. It's just amazing. And that again, that's a level of detail. The little tags on everything, bringing that world to life, so that you kind of know the place when you arrive on day one. You kind of briefed really quickly on stuff as we go through it, and that, so we can get really down to the minutiae, the dialoguing, the really important kind of character developments, because the world at large we show to you in one big picture. You're able to kind of digest that in such a way, that we can kind of come in and go, and this exists because of this. And we riff off each other a lot, Dan and I, because when it comes to world building, because we had, I think when he started with, the first time I started work with him was on the Vertigo project, New Dead Wardians. And he had a basic, he had the idea of it, which is like zombies and vampires, but we don't call them that. And he had like, you know, the whole setup of the mystery in there and stuff and what possibility there could be with it. And that was the first time when I rang him and had a really long conversation with him about vampires not being able to get erections because they have no blood flowing through their bodies. So that was because of this conversation that spun out into this really long conversation about the whole world that the thing could actually exist in. And we ended up with like 100 years of potted history of the world that we were going to be writing about. And I think after that, he just went, when we're done with this project, we should come up with our own stuff together, you know, like, you know, let's start another project, because the process of that world building became a lot of fun. We talked about, and this is in Brink as well, we have a lot of moments where, so for example, there was like a scene in New Dead Wardians where there was a vampire and her husband's died and he's visiting this country estate, and she's in this room and she's just preparing herself for this interview. And I said, and she's supposedly in the script, she was crying. And then I rang Dan up and said, do you remember that thing we were saying about like, they can't get erections, there's no tears either. There's no blood, there's still waters run deep. That's the main character. So I said, what about if she is applying her tears, because it's a part of the grieving process where they paint mascara traces down their faces because they can't actually cry. And so the butler says in the script, he says to the person coming to the house, her ladyship is the application of tears was the process. And he said the lady is applying her tears as he comes into the room. But it's great because any kind of little thing you come up with like that, Dan will work with, right? So just as an artist, you kind of go, what if this? And then Dan will go, using that, we're going to run with this. The ambigrav units, if you read the script, at the back of volume 1, in the original script, the body was actually on the floor. And then I rang down and said, what if it's actually floating in the air and every single compartment has an ambigrav unit? And we just randomly come up with names. They're not, you know, to make it sound like some sort of corporation thing. And he used that for a scene later on in the book where she blasts one of the ambigrav units, so all the gravity goes off so she can get away from these people pursuing her. So it's that riffing, that level of being able to go over world building as we do it, as well at the same time as putting the story together at the start. That's why his job doesn't really stop with just writing the script either. It's kind of way more involved in that sense. And likewise me from the art side of things. It's very much like a collaboration between the two to get the best that we can get out of it. And we've done that a lot consistently since the beginning. That way of working with each other has always been that. So it's good. Yeah, it's good fun.
Let's talk a little bit about the future, because over the past sort of 5-10 years, you've been a staple of 2000 AD.
Yeah, mad.
But one of the artists who hasn't sort of moved over to Dread.
Yeah.
Like, you know, there's always lots of chatter around, you know, the books that.
Well, I told you I drew Dread fighting a rabbit, and he said no. That may be why.
If ever that was at this stage, whether that was still an ambition, or whether the space that you've carved out at 2000 AD with Dan and Ian is not just sufficient, but actually what you'd rather be doing.
I got to do, not so long ago, I actually got to do a Future Shock, which I wrote. And it was just an off-the-cuff thing where, well, it wasn't that off-the-cuff. I really wanted to write something for 2000 AD at the same time. And I think it was before or while we were doing Brink, I can't remember. But I do remember it was during Osborne? No, what's his name? Cameron. The Conservatives were talking about getting rid of election pledges, like getting them off the internet completely. So I wrote a story about how the government invested in time travel to go back in time and rewrite history because they found out they could actually, and it creates this device and stuff. I managed to get that after I wrote 3 ideas on a Monday, sent them to Tharg, and Tharg said no. No, he didn't say anything, actually. 3 ideas on Monday. I sent 3 ideas on Wednesday, and I sent 3 on Thursday. And then he wrote to me and said, could you stop now? I'll pick this one. He actually really kindly broke down why he didn't want any of the others. And then he told me which one he wanted. This is great. The election's coming up or something like that, or some important thing was coming up. Could you get this done in this time? Because it will coincide with a real life event or something like that. I can't remember what it was. So I got it done. But that was like to have done a Future Shock was really like, that was, I really want to do more of those because that was great fun to do. And the idea was originally, it wasn't even for a Future Shock, it was for a 3 thriller. And he just made me take the 3 thriller concept and put it into a Future Shock, which was brilliant way of doing it. Overthink the idea is what I learned from that. Make it way bigger than it should be, because that's a 2000 AD story. Make it much larger than it ought to be, and then put it into a 2000 AD story. So it was brilliant doing it that way. And he was really good at being able to, just say, you should tighten this up. And I just really liked the process. I really enjoyed it. And so to do that was fantastic. To go on to work with other 2000 AD characters, I was a massive Strontium Dog fan when I was younger. And I'd love to be able to do Strontium Dog. I think it's the other one was Ace Trucking and whether I'd do a Dread, I don't know. If I'd be allowed after the bunny incident, I don't know. I think it would be pretty bad. I don't know. Yeah, it'd be great because of Mega City and stuff like that. Yeah, when I started out reading 2000 AD, I never fully appreciated Judge Dredd. I mean, coming from Poland, you don't really like warm to fascist characters, but you totally misinterpret them. But I did like for a long time I was more drawn to Strontium Dog, like way more, like fantastic series. And then but then when I think it was like when the Dark Judges came into it, definitely when Chopper came along. Chopper was one of my favorite things back in that day when Chopper first arrived. I thought that was amazing. But the Dark Judges, when I first read a strip with them in it, I realized what it was that I was reading. That was the first time it dawned. Oh, I get it now. It's like, yeah, what an idiot. It's like, how stupid am I? Oh, he's not actually like that. It's the send up of fascism. Got it now. But it took me a while. I was a kid. I was like really young. That's my excuse. I was tiny. And then, but Strontium Dog, yeah, I remember like when Durham Red showed up, and then, yeah, it was an amazing series back in the 80s. I've told you this, haven't I? When I was doing a paper round, and this is how I got my 2000 AD. And number 10 of a certain street that I worked on would never get it because I used to nick it out and read it, take it home. And he got wise to it really fast because obviously they said, we're not getting our 2000 AD. So he put 2 in, bless him, because he knew I was taking one of them. Oh, he's a lovely bloke. And then, but you shouldn't reward thievery. Is what I say. Yeah. But I think Strontium Dog would be amazing. Ace Trucking, it would be great to see that. That was recent. It would be great to see more of that. I'll back off on that one. Boo Cook did an amazing job on that. I think, yeah.
Is there the reason I asked about that is because I'm wondering where you go from here as an artist. Is there, are you happy with the way things are, or are you looking for a different kind of challenge, I guess?
That bit in Indiana Jones where he says, how are you going to get at that trout? I don't know. I'm making this up as I go along. That line is basically, what would Indy do, is my answer to everything. I don't know. I'm making this up as I go along. Yeah, I don't think I've ever had like a career path. type of deal. Apart from write more, definitely writing more. Because I do need to do that because you get more of a sense of being self-sufficient, I guess, because you can kind of just go off and do a comic on your own if you run out of work or something. You know, I definitely want to be able to do more of that. But I think in terms of career, certainly at 2000 AD, I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. That was helpful. The one where I remembered what the question was and I can't answer it. The only one.
No, it's just it's so fascinating. The number of times I've heard exactly the same thing, particularly from artists. That you know, it's not that it's just enough to be an artist, but that they haven't necessarily got a career path. You know, that things have serendipitously fallen.
Yeah. When luck plays so much of a part of it in your past, then you know you appreciate luck more. I think it's like I was saying way back when I was talking about homelessness and then ended up being an animation director. I do tend to think of these things when they, you know, when things go a little bit quiet. I go, oh, but it might well be just 1 or 2 steps away from something amazing, you know. So I kind of, you know, I mean, I got to do working with Karen Berger eventually, you know, a couple of years ago. She contacted me and I managed to get to work with her on a project for everything for Berger books. And then there's also like having, you know, I can remember just working with Dan on New Deadwardians being a Vertigo book. I mean, I had a chance way back when I was early 20s, like I don't know how old I was, and DC was still set up in London at the time and Vertigo was there, and I'd actually seen an editor there and they said, come and see us on Monday, we've got work for you. And I was too scared to go and I didn't do it. And I swore to myself that before the age of 40 I would do a book for Vertigo, and it was New Deadwardians. I actually got to do it, but through no gumption of my own. It was completely like, I've got to say, I landed on my feet there somehow, but it was nothing to do with, you know. But then again, it was because I did do a book that led on to it. It's that serendipity thing where I just did end up doing it. But anyway, no, I think going ahead, yeah, a bit like Brink, I don't want to overthink the future in terms of what's coming next because I have no idea. I hope it carries on because this is just the best job ever. It's just amazing. That's a lie, actually. Feeding baby pandas is the best job, but this bad job is flipping amazing other than baby pandas. That would be cool. If I didn't get to do this, it would be baby pandas. But I think, yeah, it's just a lot of, you know, I'm very fortunate to be where I'm at, you know, and where I've got to. You know, I never for a second think that, you know, by rights, it's not a birthright to be a comic book artist. Certainly, you know, Jesus, coming up through going to a school where you were dissuaded. I think it's when people said you can't do this, it makes it way more like, yep, doing it. Let's see if we can get there now. You're never going to be anything unless you're an accountant, right? Never touching maths, which is a good thing. Can't do mathematics. I don't know. It's just, yeah.
I think it's a lesson for us all.
Definitely. Don't anybody says you can't do art, just do it anyway. Yeah. Ignore them or feed baby pandas. They're amazing.
Well, thank you so much to Ian for taking the time. I found that fascinating. I hope you did too, Earthlets. More Brink on the way. Fingers crossed more Brass Sun as well in the future. So we'll definitely be seeing more from Ian. We'll be back in a week's time where, fingers crossed, we're going to be interviewing Brian Talbot, who is somebody who's actually, if you've been listening to the podcasts, the lockdown tapes, you'll realise that actually Brian's had a significant influence, not just in terms of his art, but in terms of connections that he's made. Artists he's introduced to writers and to editorial at 2000 AD. He's the artist on things like Luther Arkwright and Granville and obviously Nemesis the Warlock. But it's his influence outside of his actual art that I think is a really underrepresented thing. So it's going to be great to be able to chat to Brian about his work, which has had so much influence. So that'll be in a week's time. Like I said, do keep in touch if there's things you'd like to hear or indeed see from the thrillcast, all one word, at 2000ad.com. In the meantime, we shall see you in 7 days. So I hope you're staying safe. I hope you're taking care of each other. Splendid Verthrig.
Alert! 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 Fill power levels dangerously high. Alert! Alert! Read 2000 AD every week. Ask your comic book store or newsagent now. Subscribe to the galaxy's greatest comic at 2000adonline.com.